Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to an era filled with dust, sandals, and a great deal of waiting around. Because for all the emphasis on battle in the history books, the charging formations, the poetic speeches before combat, the truth is, most ancient soldiers weren't fighting at all. Instead, they sat. They ate dubious bread. They polished weapons that were destined to see more rust than actual use. And, like every human being ever, they found imaginative ways to waste time. Tonight, I'll gently guide you through the less glamorous reality of being a soldier in the ancient world. Fewer glorious charges, more boredom, lice, and questionable board games. So, soften the lights. Let your blankets fall comfortably over your shoulders, and let your mind wander with those nameless foot soldiers who spent weeks stationed on some desolate field, wondering whether today's meal would be rancid cheese, or, if fortune smiled, slightly less rancid cheese. Let's start with the Roman legions, since Rome has a habit of inserting itself into just about every conversation. Anyway, when Roman soldiers weren't stabbing barbarians or being stabbed by them, they spent a surprising amount of time doing things that sound suspiciously like chores. It turns out a Roman soldier's life was a lot less about dramatic charges and more about digging ditches. Endless ditches. You'd wake up, sharpen your gladius, and then take up your shovel. Because wherever an army went, fortifications followed. Earthworks, palisades, trenches. Building camps was almost a sacred routine. Imagine the morale. Congratulations, citizen. You've joined the mightiest army on earth. Now here's your spade. Please go move dirt until further notice. It's not the tale you hear in the epics, but it was reality. Between chores, soldiers also drilled constantly, marching in formation, practicing throwing pila, the famous Roman javelins, at straw targets. You can imagine the scene. Line after line of sweaty men, staring straight ahead, tossing sticks at what amounted to hay bales. Ancient world laser tag, with much heavier consequences if you missed later on. But not even the Roman penchant for busy work could fill all the hours. So the soldiers found ways to entertain themselves. Gambling was enormously popular, even though it was technically against army regulations. Predictably, when something is banned in history, soldiers immediately do it anyway. They even carried dice with them, often carved out of bone, because nothing soothes the soul like losing your month's wages to the guy who also happens to be your tent mate. And when dice grew dull, there were board games. Roman legionaries loved a game called tabula, essentially the great-great-grandfather of backgammon. There are even scratched boards carved into stone pavement around old forts, as if men 2,000 years ago had sighed, "Yes, lovely marble floor." But you know what this really needs? Some dice tracks. Now, when soldiers weren't throwing dice or filling in trenches that they had just dug the day before, sometimes they wrote letters. These are little windows into their minds, captured on thin wood tablets or papyrus. One soldier requested socks from home because, apparently, being Rome's elite conqueror didn't prevent your toes freezing off in northern Britain. Another soldier, stationed at Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, sent a polite but desperate plea for beer, which, again, does a lot to puncture the image of unstoppable legionaries marching on iron discipline. Underneath the armor, they were still men deeply disappointed with the catering. Let's drift sideways to the Greek world. Greek hoplites, those proud farmers-turned-soldiers with their shining bronze helmets, also spent far less time clashing spears than you might think. Campaigns often meant sitting in a field somewhere, glaring across at the enemy camp and waiting, until everyone got bored enough to negotiate peace or finally shuffle into a clumsy battle. So what did hoplites do in camp while waiting? They did what Greeks always did. They sang songs with slightly too much philosophy in them. They competed at athletics, and, naturally, they complained about food. The rations in a Greek army were famously uninspired. Barley porridge, more barley porridge, occasional scraps of meat if you were lucky. One imagines a soldier sighing theatrically, poking at his bowl and muttering, "Truly, the glory of our civilization rests upon this wet lump." Wrestling was another common pastime. Nothing alleviates the boredom of campaign life quite like occasionally body-slamming your fellow man into the dirt. Plato himself hinted that soldiers needed wrestling both for discipline and for entertainment. So if you can imagine 20,000 spearmen sitting around a field, occasionally getting up to wrestle each other in the mud, you start to get a feel for Greek warfare between the wars. Scholarly, sweaty, and perpetually half-hungry. Now, soldiers outside of Greece and Rome also found creative ways to deal with time passing in slow motion. The Persians, for example, were well known for their fondness for hunting as sport. If there's one thing you can count on with ancient elites, it's that they will find any excuse to get on a horse and skewer some wildlife. So when Persian soldiers had downtime, who shows up to camp but a royal officer suggesting everyone join in a carefully staged hunt that was essentially large-scale military training disguised as fun. Of course, this was less relaxing for the animals involved. But for the soldiers, it kept skills sharp without the boredom of chopping wood or staring at dice rolls. Meanwhile, in pharaonic Egypt, soldiers on campaign sometimes amused themselves by writing graffiti. On walls, on rocks, on tombs they really shouldn't have been scratching up. Some left little cartoons mocking officers. Others carved doodles that suggested, how to put this delicately, that bawdy humor in the barracks has existed since the dawn of civilization. It's comforting in a way that across thousands of years and languages, soldiers everywhere left crude drawings of human anatomy when they were bored. Now, let's soften the lens for a moment and imagine these camps at night, fires flickering, the day's complaints fading into tired chatter, dice put away, wool socks adjusted if you were lucky enough to have them. Soldiers often sang together before sleep. Songs about home, songs mocking the enemy across the hill. Songs complaining again, there was a lot of that, but all blended into a low murmur of voices half humming into the dark. Because when your workday involves carrying shields and digging trenches, something about simple songs in unison must have felt reassuring, like a reminder that you weren't completely stuck in this endless waiting alone, even when things appeared calm. However, commanders often found ways to make soldiers' lives more pointlessly active. The Carthaginians were known for mixing mundane chores with discipline drills, creating what might be described as the ancient world's worst summer camp. Write your family, tend the fires, march 8 miles in the mud, and then celebrate with yet another serving of pulverized grains. Such routines blurred the line between training and punishment, so much so that some historians argue Carthage treated boredom itself as a military enemy. But boredom always wins in the end. Humans are endlessly creative when it comes to making tedious situations mildly entertaining. So yes, soldiers invented camp games, tossing stones at a target, shouting contests, friendly mock duels with sticks. We might smirk at the simplicity, but when supplies were short and nights were long, that's all that was needed to pass the time. What's fascinating is how consistently across cultures, soldier life in downtime revolved around 3 pillars. First, gambling. Always gambling. From dice in Rome, to knucklebones in Greece, to improvised tokens used across nomadic armies, the instinct to risk your pay on sheer chance never failed. Commanders banned it constantly, only to discover their men continuing as enthusiastically as ever. Second, storytelling. Soldiers swapped tales endlessly. Stories of home, exaggerated battles from the past, absurd gossip about officers, or legends borrowed from the camp followers who traveled alongside. A camp left too quiet was a dangerous one, so filling the nights with chatter gave structure to lives otherwise reduced to waiting. And third, maintenance of weapons, which also doubled as distraction. Sharpening a blade that might never be used could take hours. Some weapons were technically combat-ready, but polished to near perfection anyway because in its own way, polishing a spearhead was soothing. So gambling, gossip, and gratuitous polishing. History's least glamorous trio of military traditions. But let's also pause for pity, because boredom had darker consequences too. Without enough diversion or leadership, idleness could turn chaotic. Drunkenness in camp was almost ritual. Roman officers tried to ration wine, then discovered soldiers simply bartered until someone surrendered their share. Violence sometimes broke out after too much drink and too little to do. And of course, disease spread quickly. Inactivity plus crowded camps plus iffy sanitation, a breeding ground no soldier wanted. So, in essence, while epic poets portrayed armies eternally locked in swift combat, the majority of time was spent waiting. Gambling, drinking, scratching bites, nursing stomach cramps, and trying inventively to complain without being punished. Let's drift to a gentle close for this part by imagining 2 soldiers, one Roman, one Greek, though neither is particularly glamorous. Hey again, let's ease back into the campfires, the clatter of dice, and the uncomfortable reality that the life of a soldier, no matter what age, was usually an exercise in passing time. Because battles might last an afternoon, but the waiting could stretch for months. Imagine, if you will, sitting in a tent on the edge of nowhere. You've marched, you've blistered your heels raw, and now you wait. For what? For someone in charge, usually a man with far too much jewelry and a notably poor temper, to decide when something actually happens. So, in the meantime, you invent ways to be less miserable. That was the real rhythm of ancient soldiering. Less spears thrust dramatically into the sky. More men slouched against their packs thinking, if we don't leave soon, I may actually scream. Idleness in the Hellenistic camps. Let's float first into the Hellenistic period, where Alexander the Great had rather inconveniently conquered most of the map and left behind bored. Garrisons everywhere, if you were garrisoned. In a newly founded Alexandria, which popped up like mushrooms after a rain, there were two likely activities: grumbling about the heat and pestering the locals. Soldiers had to deal with language barriers and food that never quite agreed with their stomachs. When not handling these thrills, they staged contests just to pass the hours. Who could throw a javelin farthest? Who could outdrink whom? And who could out-wrestle the rest while half covered in dust? Now some of the more literate soldiers amused themselves with reading. You might think this paints a charming picture of cultured warriors. And yes, a few did enjoy papyrus scrolls, but it's also worth noting that many just used abandoned scrolls as kindling, which to ancient librarians is roughly equivalent to punching a kitten. And speaking of fire, Hellenistic camps loved bonfires not just for cooking, but for storytelling. The older soldiers, veterans of campaigns nobody even believed anymore, would launch into tales. I remember back in Persia, followed by a series of dubious details that grew taller with each retelling. Everyone knew they were lies, but everyone listened anyway, because listening was easier than porridge and silence. In the shadow of pharaohs, now glide down to Egypt. Egyptian armies, especially in the New Kingdom, carried with them musicians, no joke, whose job was to play for the camp. Imagine a dusty plain dotted with tents and suddenly a small orchestra of flutes and drums striking up. You could be ankle-deep in mud and still hear a reed pipe squeaking out a rendition of something vaguely cheerful. Convenient? Yes. Musical quality? Questionable, at best. Soldiers also carved into stone, as we mentioned before, but here in Egypt it reached an art form. Graffiti scrawled by idle hands is scattered across walls. Jokes, prayers, idle sketches. Many inscriptions read something like, "I was here guarding nothing," which is, in fairness, exactly the timeless summary of downtime. And naturally, there was beer. Egyptians brewed a thick, porridge-like beer, more food than drink. So men didn't just quench their thirst, they replaced supper outright. Because nothing screams fine dining like slurping down grainy liquid and pretending it's a treat. The boring world of Roman engineers. We circle back to Rome because, simply put, they were the masters of inventing work just to keep men awake. The legionary downtime motto might as well have been, "If you're not busy, we'll make you busy." March stops, build a camp wall. Finish that. Start digging drainage ditches. Finish that. Refill the ditch because the officer changed his mind. When men genuinely stopped moving dirt, they collapsed into simple games. Dice throwing, of course, but also a kind of stone tossing known as duodecim scripta, or 12 lines. Think of it like strategic tic-tac-toe with gambling added in. And if that sounds thrilling, I assure you it wasn't. But if losing a week's pay to a badly carved dice cube distracts you from thinking about the fact your boots smell like death, then sure, it's thrilling enough. Another curious Roman diversion, animal care. Armies required herds, goats, cattle, pack mules that were always wandering off. Bored soldiers became unpaid zookeepers, chasing donkeys that escaped into woods, or attempting, futilely, to herd sheep across boggy fields. Later writers loved to praise Rome's discipline, but none of them tell you about the poor legionary trudging after a goat named Dinner for the 15th time that week. Nomads at leisure, we've looked at settled empires. So what about nomadic armies? Scythians, Huns, Mongols even further along the timeline. For them, downtime usually meant sitting by grazing animals. These men basically babysat horses, hundreds of them. Feed the horses, water the horses, comb the horses, complain about the horses. Horses were lifelines, so tending to them filled every idle moment. But nomads weren't immune to games either. They had archery contests where young warriors competed to hit targets from horseback, sometimes while riding backwards. Which sounds impressive until you remember this was also an excuse to show off in front of everyone. And what's a bored young man's favorite thing? Exactly. That storytelling remained king, but with flavor. Nomadic stories usually involved improbable ancestors, heroic hunts, and the occasional scene where someone conquered an impossible beast with, and this part was important, absolutely no help from anyone else. Apparently, modesty never crossed campfires either. The great medical pastime, lice, yes, lice. Humans have been plagued since time began, and soldiers, packed into close quarters, made perfect hosts. Picking at lice, either your own or someone else's, was one of the most persistent activities carried out during inactive hours. Soldiers even joked about them and gave them nicknames. Ancient military comedy, ladies and gentlemen. 30 men staring into candlelight, laughing bitterly about the general living in their hair. Music without instruments, it wasn't always flutes and lyres. Sometimes music-making was just rhythm, pounding shields in unison, clapping, humming. Armies used songs to pass time and to regulate marching steps. But in downtime, they became entertainment. A chance to sing insults about the enemy, exaggerated hymns to their commander, and drinking songs no one remembered correctly past verse 1. And strikingly, you hear echoes of the same in completely different armies. Roman marching chants, Persian drinking choruses, Greek hymns, Chinese camp ballads. They probably sounded very different, but they served the same purpose, giving men stuck in limbo something resembling unity, melancholy of distance, and if all else failed, soldiers wrote, or for those who could not write, dictated. Letters from Roman Britain show endless requests. Warmer tunics, sauce, more wheat, and, again, socks. Babylonian tablets record men requesting better rations. Han Dynasty scraps mention longing for holidays, family rituals, New Year feasts. What's both tragic and grounding here is how similar those voices sound. Across oceans and millennia, men posted on some frontier fell into the same rhythm of longing, missing home, filling paper or clay with trivial requests and bigger aching silences. Reading them today, you sense more boredom than glory, which is, ironically, the truest record of military life. Wrapping this watch, so when we step back, it becomes embarrassingly simple to answer. How did ancient soldiers pass the time when they weren't fighting? Badly, mostly. They drank when possible, whittled toys when desperate, gambled despite regulations. sang off-key, staged fake contests, teased each other mercilessly, boiled their rations until flavor fainted away, tended animals, cursed commanders, and wrote plaintive letters home asking for socks. They waited and they dreamed, and they filled the silence with anything else they could think of, because silence, when combined with uncertainty, is exhausting. It's easy to forget when reading about Alexander or Caesar that their glory stood on the patient shoulders of thousands of tired men, most of whom spent less time fighting and more time counting pebbles by the roadside, or absent-mindedly plucking lice from seams, and so, with those soldiers curling now into rough blankets, fires dimming, dice set aside, songs trailing into murmurs, and tomorrow's boredom quietly approaching, we'll let Part 2 close. Not with triumph, but with that quiet hum of idleness, which, ironically, may be history's most universal sound. A soldier's longest day. The sun was going down over the dusty horizon, and the campfires were already flickering to life. Gaius, a Roman legionary, leaned against his pack and tapped his dice cup against his knee. He'd been carrying the same set since he was 17, bone cubes polished smooth by restless fingers. The battle they had all been promised, some grand clash with a local tribe, hadn't materialized. The enemy, quite rudely, had decided to hold their ground behind hills and wait. So the legion waited too, 40,000 men sitting on their heels, discovering just how dull glory could be when it never arrived on time. 3 denarii you'll lose again, muttered Lucius, the tent mate who always made his prediction before the game as if it helped. I don't lose, I just invest poorly, Gaius replied, and rolled anyway. The dice clattered across a carved board scratched into the wood by some anonymous hand months ago. They landed badly, as usual, and Lucius smirked. Gaius sighed. This was the 3rd night in a row his luck had abandoned him, which was only fair. After all, the gods had little else to do out here except interfere in dice games. Across the camp, another soldier was bent over parchment. Marcus had been writing for nearly an hour, tongue stuck to the corner of his mouth as he carefully formed his words. His letter home explained again that, yes, he was still alive, yes, the weather was terrible, yes, the porridge was still only porridge. And if his mother could possibly send another pair of socks, his toes would be forever grateful. War, it seemed, was slowly dissolving into one long search for footwear. He leaned back, flexed his cramped fingers, and looked around. Beyond the firelight, he could hear faint singing. A group of Spaniard auxiliaries had gathered with a hand drum, banging out a steady rhythm while crooning a song in their own tongue. None of the Romans understood it, but everyone recognized 2 things instantly. The song was about drinking, and it was slightly obscene. Soldiers everywhere could identify obscenity in any language. A little farther off, 2 men wrestled in the dust. It wasn't organized sport. It was just Victor and Publius, who had been hurling insults at each other since noon and decided the only solution was to grab one another by the waist and see who collapsed first. Around them, a small crowd cheered and called out bets. Some voted for Victor, because his arms were thick as tree trunks. Others chose Publius on the grounds that he had a nasty habit of biting, which wasn't technically against the rules. After 10 minutes, both men were too tired to continue, and the crowd drifted away with the mild disappointment of men who had seen their evening entertainment end prematurely. Someone muttered that tomorrow they ought to at least use sticks and shields just to raise the stakes. Everyone agreed this was an excellent idea. Meanwhile, near the edge of the camp, young Titus crouched by a piece of wood, carving it carefully with his dagger. He wasn't making anything practical. Titus carved because it felt better than sitting still. By the time the fire had burned low, the wood resembled something between a dog and a badly cooked loaf of bread. But his tent mates all nodded solemnly and agreed it was indeed a dog. "That's loyalty for you," murmured Lucius as he walked past. Even boredom had rules, and one of them was pretending your friend's ugly carving looked magnificent. Far away, over another hill, there was a different camp entirely. Greek hoplites, also waiting for action, were sprawled on mats, chewing barley bread with the resigned air of men being punished by the gods. One soldier, an older man named Theon, sighed heavily between bites. Bread again. Our descendants will one day write songs about our noble battle with this barley loaf. Another soldier hummed a sarcastic reply. Then, to pass the time, they began wrestling again, though slower and less dramatic than the Romans. It was less about victory and more about finding any excuse to not be sitting still on hard dirt. As night stretched, the Greeks turned to song. Not drinking songs this time, but proper odes memorized as boys. Verse about rivers and heroes, or about cities shining in sunshine far away. Did they mean every word? Not particularly. But after enough repetitions, the rhythm alone was enough to soothe them into forgetful calm. In a different corner of the world, a soldier of the Han army stared down at the black lines of a board game scratched onto clay. His opponent placed a polished stone tile with maddening confidence. With no battles on the horizon, the game had slipped into hours of pushing stones back and forth. To outsiders, it might have looked uneventful, a bit of shuffling around a grid. But within camp, small victories mattered. Win today, and maybe you forget your stomach is empty. Lose, and you spend the next day sharpening weapons just a little more aggressively. By firelight, some soldiers took turns reading short poems aloud. One piece compared the army's horses to clouds sweeping across plains. Another described the loneliness of mountains at night, echoing faintly inside every man listening. Poetry in such moments wasn't entertainment so much as shared melancholy, allowed to exist without anyone naming it. Back in Rome's camp, the mood grew louder. Wine had been passed around, already watered down by ration, but never watered enough. Soon men were laughing, half singing insults about their officers. The human voice, stretched by boredom and drink, somehow grew into a chorus that carried far into the night. Of course, officers themselves pretended not to notice. They sat in their own circle, sipping in moderation, talking of maps and possible maneuvers. They knew as well as the men did, tomorrow nothing would happen. Another dawn, another wait, another day of dice carving, complaints, and porridge. But keeping discipline meant pretending that soon, very soon, the enemy would finally oblige them with activity. And then the lice. Because every camp, no matter how disciplined, eventually gave in to a nightly round of scratching. By firelight, Soldiers methodically picked at seams, mumbling curses at the invisible colonies thriving in their tunics. A Roman diary once called lice the enemy that never negotiates, which might be the most accurate observation in all of military history. It was annoying, yes, but also strangely communal. Picking, joking, groaning. It gave men something to do, if nothing else. Midnight grew heavy. One by one, fires sank. Dice were tucked back, carvings pushed into packs. Letters finished with half-hearted farewells. The camp grew quieter, save for snores and the occasional cough. Yet in pockets of shadow, the games still continued. Two soldiers played a last clandestine round, gambling on buttons and belt scraps because actual coins had been lost 3 nights ago. A Celt auxiliary leaned against his shield, softly singing a heroic ballad about some distant ancestor who had slain a beast 3 sizes too large. No one interrupted him, because everyone recognized the sound. Boredom transformed into art, at least for the length of a song. The soldiers slept eventually, not because they were at peace, but because they were exhausted by the long labor of having nothing to do. Ancient warfare was mostly that. Soldiers slipping into uneasy rest after endless hours of trying to stay occupied. When the dawn horn sounded, sharp, cold, unwelcome, the familiar routine would begin again. Breakfast, complaining, dice, wrestling, carving, writing, polishing weapons, perhaps a practice march, and again waiting, because battles might define history. But soldiers? Soldiers mostly defined time. Hours stretched into days, nights into weeks, and in that endless space between wars, they passed the hours however they could. With dice, with stories, with songs, with carvings, and with the faint, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be different. So if you ever picture those great armies of history, the Romans gazing sternly beneath helmets, the Greeks lined shoulder to shoulder, the Persians flashing their fine horses, remember the nights. Remember the long stretch of idleness, the dice rolling across dirt, the bad carvings of dogs that looked like bread loaves, the drunken songs drifting into moonlight. Because that was soldiering most of the time, not clashing steel, not heroic speeches, just waiting, and trying not to lose your mind while you did. Another day of nothing. The morning horn had sounded, but nobody hurried. Why would they? The camp had been sitting outside the enemy walls for weeks, and still nothing had happened. Decimus, a weather-beaten Roman foot soldier, dragged himself from his blanket with the air of a man personally betrayed by the universe. He rubbed his eyes, stared at the horizon, still full of enemy fortifications and stubborn silence, and muttered, "Another glorious day of absolutely nothing." He strapped on his sandals, winced at the fresh blister forming, and shuffled to the fire pit where his tent mates were already distributing the breakfast. Yesterday's bread, which was only slightly stiffer than the shields leaning nearby, Flaccus, always the optimist, banged it against the ground and said, "See? Still edible." The bread snapped in half like a spear shaft. Flaccus shrugged and chewed anyway. After breakfast came the usual ritual, cleaning weapons for no particular reason. Swords were sharpened until they gleamed, despite the fact that no enemy seemed willing to come out and test them. Decimus dragged his whetstone across the blade, sparks flickering in the light, and muttered under his breath, "If we sit here much longer, I'll polish my gladius so thin it turns into a butter knife." A centurion strolled past, nodding approvingly. "Excellent work, soldier. Keep at it." "Yes," Decimus murmured, "because the city walls will surely surrender at the shine." By midday, with chores exhausted and tempers rising, the camp came alive with games. Dice clattered across scratched boards like an impatient drumbeat. Gaius, the youngest of the tent, threw his bones with reckless confidence. "Fortune favors me today," he announced grandly. The dice landed poorly. His fellow soldiers groaned, laughed, and scooped up his meager bet of coins. "That's the third day in a row," Lucius pointed out. "Maybe the gods just don't like you." "The gods are jealous," Gaius insisted. "They fear my inevitable victory." The next throw robbed him of his last denarius. The gods remained unimpressed. Away from the gamblers, Publius crouched with his favorite pastime, carving wood. His knife moved slowly, peeling curls from a block of scrap. Around him lay his collection of half-formed creatures. A horse with suspiciously dog-like ears, a pig that looked like a potato in distress, and his newest creation, an elephant whose trunk appeared to be melting off its face. Still, men drifted by to admire them. "That's magnificent, Publius," one said with utter lack of sincerity. "Looks just like my mother-in-law," another added. Publius grinned. He wasn't sculpting masterpieces. He was sculpting distractions. And distractions were of more value than wine. That evening, as shadows stretched long, music found the camp. A group of Iberian auxiliaries thumped on makeshift drums. Old helmets flipped upside down and sang songs nobody understood. But everyone knew by instinct were rude. Soon the Romans clapped along, stamping their feet in time, some attempting dance moves that resembled men accidentally wrestling with their own legs. Even officers watched with indulgent smiles. Discipline was important, but spirits mattered more. Soldiers could complain endlessly over porridge, blisters, and boredom. But drunken songs had a way of turning grievances into the shared joke of survival. The chorus carried long into twilight, a rough, uneven chant that stumbled but did not stop. In another part of the world, far beyond Rome's horizon, a different camp hummed the same tired tune of waiting. Greek hoplites lounged beneath their shields, armor stacked in careless piles. Theon, a man who had fought in more campaigns than he could count, squinted into the smoke of the fire. "Once again, no battle," he announced with tragic seriousness, as though anyone expected otherwise. "The enemy cowers in the city. We sit, and barley bread sits with us." His tentmates groaned at the mention of barley bread. After weeks of chewing the same grain mash, they would have gladly fled into battle just for a change of taste. To pass the time, the Greeks turned to insults. One after another, they hurled exaggerated jabs at each other's ancestry, appearance, and intelligence. The insults were less about offense and more about art, Who could craft the cleverest sting? You once hid behind a goat during combat, one shouted. Yes, Theon replied coolly, and the goat was braver than you are now. Laughter rolled through the camp. Losing your temper meant losing the game. Maintaining calm while barbs flew proved your worth just as surely as a spear point. Later, when insults grew stale, the Greeks sang slow, droning hymns about wine and sunshine, the night filled with voices weaving longing into sound. They had no wine nor sunshine, but in the repetition of verse, imagination was good enough. And farther still, in a Persian cavalry camp, entertainment took a different form. Horses grazed nearby, endlessly demanding attention. Soldiers brushed their coats, fed them carefully measured fodder, and cursed the way their animals seemed better fed than they were. To keep spirits alive, commanders organized hunts. Rabbits, deer, anything unlucky enough to cross the plain became stand-in enemies. Cavalrymen thundered after them with spears, returned sweaty and triumphant, and declared the day's pursuit a valuable exercise. "We have conquered 6 rabbits," one joked proudly. "Surely the world trembles." If the world did tremble, it did so quietly. Still, at least the chase had offered an illusion of purpose. Something to remember other than sharpening swords or chewing dry bread. As midnight crept across every camp, silence finally settled, broken only by low snores, stirring animals, the soft scratch of lice being discovered in seams. Decimus lay on his back, staring at stars he'd seen since childhood, though back then they had been less depressing. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, a phrase that had by now turned into superstition. Maybe tomorrow the walls would open and men would fight. Maybe tomorrow glory would find them. Flaccus rolled over, already half asleep, muttering through a dream of food. "If tomorrow brings bread again, may the gods choke." And slowly the fires sank, and soldiers across nations curled into cloaks too short and beds too hard. Dice rested in dirt, carvings tucked under arms like charms. Songs faded in memory, barley bread hardened by neglect. Horses shifted in the dark. Another day of soldiering had ended without fanfare, filled not with battle, but with the unremarkable persistence of living through boredom. And just beyond sleep, the world waited with them, as it always did. Because whether Roman, Greek, Persian, or anyone else, a soldier's truest skill had always been patience. And so they waited again, together, silently, under the same tired sky. The night that took its time. The camp had learned to stop expecting battle. Morning came and the horns still sounded, but by now the men no longer leapt to attention. They stretched, scratched at old wool cloaks, and glanced lazily at the enemy's walls across the plain. High, silent, and annoyingly confident. Decimus sat at the edge of his tent, leather straps of his sandals dangling loose. He'd fought in real battles before, skirmishes soaked in dust and sweat. But this siege promised none of that. Just bread, dice, and bickering. He tugged at the strap, cursed its refusal to knot properly, and muttered, "We came to conquer the world. Instead, I'm conquered by a shoe." Lucius appeared with a crooked smile, holding a wooden cup of watered vinegar. To anyone else, it might have looked suspiciously like punishment. To soldiers, it was just another beverage in the endless catalog of disappointments. "Here, drink," Lucius said. Decimus sniffed the liquid. His nose wrinkled. "This isn't wine," Lucius grinned. "It pretends very convincingly to be until you taste it." Decimus drank anyway, winced, and offered no further comment. It wasn't worth the energy. The real noise began, as always, in the heat of noon. Dice smacked across wooden boards, rolling from one hand to another, fortunes tumbling uselessly into the dirt. Young Gaius, still foolish enough to trust in the gods of chance, threw his dice in dramatic flourish. "Look upon this throw kissed by Fortuna herself," he shouted. The dice landed miserably. His opponents howled with laughter, and one scooped up his wagered coins as though snatching meat from a starving dog. "Fortuna's lips are cold," Lucius remarked dryly. "Fortuna is jealous of me," Gaius answered, smiling bravely as he lost yet again. The men laughed at him, and Gaius laughed too, because laughing was easier than facing the emptiness of another day. When coins were gone, men found new games, and Publius found his knife. He hunched at the fire, carving lines into a chunk of wood. Slowly, a dubious creature emerged. At first a lump, then a beast, then something closer to a badly starved dog. The others came to look. One man tilted his head. "Is it a wolf?" "It's a horse," Publius announced. The men laughed kindly. Someone said, "The horse has suffered," but they admired it anyway, passing it from hand to hand. Soon others grabbed scraps of wood, carving their own ugly beasts. By evening, the campfire circle was surrounded by a grotesque zoo of misshapen toys, crooked lions, stumbling pigs, and a bird that looked exactly like a boot. Publius looked at them all with solemn pride. "Tomorrow," he said, "we carve the gods themselves." His comrades cheered. They liked the thought of Jupiter and Mars reduced to silly shapes in their hands. Night came, and the music arrived, as it always did. A group of Iberian auxiliaries hammered rhythm from their helmets, shaking dust into the air. Voices followed, thick accents and bawdy verses no one could quite understand, though everyone knew what kind of jokes they held. Soon the entire camp joined, clapping shields, stomping feet, groaning half-finished rhymes. Soldiers leaned on one another, weaving words about barley porridge, about officers with thick heads, about battles they'd never seen but claimed to have fought anyway. For an hour, the fortress walls across the plain disappeared, and the boredom vanished in stamping and laughter. Even the officers smiled, pretending not to hear the songs that mocked them very directly. Far away, in another camp beneath another sky, Greek hoplites waited too. They had less wine and thinner meals, but more words. Around their fire, insults flew like practiced arrows. Veterans mocked the youths. The youths mocked the veterans. One man shouted that Theon, the old soldier, once hid behind a goat during a raid. "Yes," Theon replied evenly, "and the goat fought more bravely than you will ever manage." The men roared in delight. The game wasn't to sting, but to endure, to take the lash of wit and sit strong, smiling through it as one would stand steady in a phalanx. Later, when insults ran out, they sang solemn hymns. droning verses about vineyards and rivers and the glow of far-off cities. No one believed themselves in a vineyard, but pretending was easier with closed eyes. Even on the far reaches of the Han frontier, soldiers passed the same twilight. Two of them crouched over a scratchboard, moving black and white stones with immense seriousness. They'd been playing for days already. Around them, men were quiet. Some recited poetry under their breath, verse about mountain paths and falling leaves. For a moment, those who listened imagined not a battlefield, but the hush of forests, the taste of autumn fruit. And then a shadow play began. Lamplight flickering through stretched hides, painted shapes moving like spirits. Men leaned forward, smiling faintly as mythical beasts danced in light. For an hour, war itself ceased to exist. There was only shadow, firelight, and longing. Back in Rome's camp, Decimus finally found his parchment. He scrawled lines with aching hand. "We are well. The food is steady. My boots fit fine." All lies, of course, but lies that comforted those at home. He folded it neatly, leaned back, and watched sparks rise into the night. Lucius leaned on his shoulder drowsily. "Do you think we'll be remembered?" he asked softly. "Of course," Decimus replied. "The scribes write every word." "About the generals," Lucius laughed. "Then let them know we wasted more hours than we fought." He closed his eyes, still chuckling, then slipped into sleep. Decimus lay awake a while longer. He could hear Gaius still rattling dice in his sleep, Flaccus humming tunelessly under his breath, and Publius snoring beside his wooden menagerie. Above, the stars stared down as unblinking witnesses, unchanged by the tired rituals of men. It would be the same tomorrow. Bread, dice, carvings, songs. And the next day, and the next, and perhaps one day, at last, a battle. But for now, boredom was the only enemy they knew how to fight. The long march to nowhere. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the fields, disguising the smell of yesterday's campfires and the far less noble aroma rising from the latrine trench. The army stirred slowly, like a beast that had slept too heavily. Cloaks rattled, shields groaned as men dragged them across dirt. Decimus woke to the sound of Gaius muttering prayers over his dice again. He sat up, pulled his blanket tighter over his shoulders, and looked across the camp with a mixture of fatigue and resignation. Today, he thought, would be indistinguishable from yesterday. The enemy still refused to leave their fortress. The officers still pretended this waiting had purpose. And the men? Well, the men would simply do what bored men always did. Find something, anything, to fill the hours. "Gaius," Decimus said quietly. "The gods don't care about your dice." Gaius didn't even look up. "They do. They mock me with them." Decimus sighed. He wished for battle. No, not even battle. Simply for variety. He shifted his boots against the earth and wondered, not for the first time, if eternity wasn't a shining kingdom of peace but this. Endless camp life punctuated with porridge and chance games. By mid-morning, a group had gathered near the edge of the camp for what they called our races. They cleared a strip of ground, lined with stones, and set off sprinting. Boots thudded, cloaks flapped, men stumbled and wheezed. It was ridiculous. Their armor weighed more than any sane athlete would carry, but laughter rippled across the field, and that was the point. No one cared who won except the winners, who bragged until everyone wanted to throttle them. Lucius wandered back from the chaos with cheeks flushed red. "I beat 3 men!" he shouted at Decimus, chest heaving. "I might be old, but I still outrun the lazy." "You tripped 2 of them," Decimus replied calmly. Lucius ignored him, glowing with mock triumph. Each man had to claim his little victories, however absurd. Later, Publius returned to his carvings. This time he tried a goat, though within an hour it looked alarmingly like a potato with horns. He set it down proudly anyway. A crowd formed as always because nothing drew attention like communal ridicule. "Wonderful," one man said gravely. "At last we see Apollo's sacred goat brought to life." Another added, "A goat fit for Olympus, or at least for soup." Publius bore it all with theatrical dignity. He knew his animals were disasters, but they had become talismans for the camp. Whoever received one carried it as a charm. Some tucked them into boots. Others kept them near the dice board, hoping a crooked wooden cow could tilt fortune their way. The goat-turned-potato passed from hand to hand until finally it landed with Gaius, who insisted that this carving, unlike his dice, would surely bring him favor. He promptly lost 2 games in a row, but now everyone declared it the most powerful charm of all, not for victory, but for guaranteeing failure with astonishing consistency. The sun leaned west, and men found shade where they could. Some sharpened blades absent-mindedly, letting the rasping sound fill silence. Some lay flat, staring at the sky until sleep overtook them. Others wrote letters in uneven script. One man scolded his brother for forgetting a debt. Another requested wool socks again, though this time he added the polite reminder that last year's pair had already disintegrated. Decimus tried to write but gave up. He had no new lies to send, no fresh reassurances about health and cheer. And honesty, of course, was forbidden. No mother needed to hear that her son was guarded more closely by boredom than by swords. As shadows stretched long, the music began again. Helmet drums, pots clanged like cymbals, and voices rising together in barely recognizable tunes. The Iberians led with verses, the meaning unclear but tone obvious, jokes about women, officers, or both. Soon Romans chorused back until the whole camp sang in an off-key competition of mockery. One officer strolled past, frowning at the racket. "Maintain order," he barked. "Yes, sir," the men chorused brightly, before bursting into a new verse that rhymed the officer's name with goat droppings. By the time twilight fell, even he was smiling reluctantly because discipline had its place. But so did laughter, far to the south under cooler stars. Egyptian soldiers waited along the Nile frontier. They too had learned the art of passing empty days. Some strummed reed flutes, producing tones more shrill than sweet. Others scratched graffiti into temple walls. Little drawings of boats and animals covered stones that had once carried holy inscriptions. Some carvings were crude, others surprisingly elegant. But all whispered the same plea across centuries. We were here. We were bored. In the deep violet dusk, one soldier hummed while another tapped rhythm on his knee. Before long it was music. Not good music, but human enough to tether lonely men together until sleep arrived. Across the steep plains of Asia, Scythian horsemen huddled around fires. Their time passed in horse care, feeding, brushing, endlessly fretting over saddles that seemed to groan more than the soldiers. At night they staged contests, not with dice but arrows. They set jars in the distance, galloped past, and loosed shafts while twisting backward in the saddle. No one needed to win. The point was to boast afterward, and they boasted with such exaggeration that the arrows themselves would have blushed. One young rider claimed he split a jar in half while blindfolded. His friends clapped solemnly, pretending belief with wide, innocent eyes. Everyone understood that boasting was simply another way of laughing at time. Night fell, and the Roman camp slowed to silence. Dice rested, carvings lined neatly, letters hidden under cloaks. Men curled on the ground, snoring, muttering, sometimes laughing in their dreams. Decimus pulled his blanket up against the chill air, listening to the murmured songs fading into memory. "Tomorrow," Lucius whispered beside him. "Perhaps tomorrow we fight?" "Yes," Decimus replied softly, though he didn't believe it. Tomorrow would hold the same as today. Bread, dice, carving, singing. Soldiers would rise, grumble, invent games, tease each other, and build another day out of fragments of patience. And so it continued, for Romans outside enemy walls, for Greeks staring at stubborn cities, for Persians chasing rabbits, for Egyptians doodling in temples, for Scythians boasting of impossible shots, for Chinese soldiers bent over poetry and game boards, different soils beneath their feet, different stars overhead, but the same long hours to be endured. Battle lasted a heartbeat. Waiting lasted a lifetime.